Hello, everybody. It is Mr. Stevens here with the conclusion to Brothers in Arms, The Lives and Experiences of the Men Who Fought the Civil War in Their Own Words by William C. Davis. Let's jump right in to where we left off in the last video as we conclude this historical book. And we're going to go right back in. I am daily touched to the heart by seeing these poor homesick boys and exhausted men wandering about in threadbare uniforms. Seeking the nearest route home, they have a careworn and anxious look, a played-out manner. How different it was for the Confederate soldiers after the surrenders. No pay, no transportation, no cheering crowds for them. After turning over his weapon and giving his parole, he was on his own. Generous victors like Grant and Sherman did open their commissaries to the Southerners and let those who claimed to own animals take them from rebel wagons and cannon. But how a Confederate soldier made his way back home was exclusively his own business. The Union gave ship transportation as far as New Orleans or Galveston to some who lived west of the Mississippi, while some others occasionally found compassion in a military railroad or wagon train commander. But mostly they walked, sometimes hundreds of miles. The roads of the South almost choked with soldiers trudging homeward, passing through a land strained to the breaking point by the war. When they asked at farmhouses for food and water, there was little to give. Worse, all along the war, they could see the destruction the war wrought on their homeland. Truly, theirs was a trail of tears. Few Confederates managed to survive the war with their uniforms as pristine as this Louisiana soldier's frock coat or shell jacket. Nevertheless, the remains of the uniform in which they marched home were symbols of their cause, proudly worn. Generous in victory, many Union commanders opened well-stocked commissary wagons like these to the hungry Confederates before they made their long march home. For many a Johnny Reb, the only souvenirs he would have would be the buttons he saved from the ruins of his uniform. There is complete revulsion in public feeling. No more talk about help from France and England, but all about emigration to Mexico and Brazil. We are irretrievably ruined. Eliza F. Andrews, Georgia. Some, of course, simply could not give up, or the trip home was simply too much to face. Too proud to concede defeat and too bitter to live under Yankee rule, they headed toward the Rio Grande, where 5,000 or more joined with a few generals to cross the border and offer their services to Mexico. Eventually, many of them started colonies at Carlotta and elsewhere. Others went even farther from home, to Central America, Venezuela, Brazil, and other Latin countries, while still more crossed the ocean to Europe, taking residence in England and France. Some took service in the army of the Khedive in Egypt. More journeyed to the Far East, and several hundred recrossed the Atlantic to settle in Canada, within sight of the United States. It was the largest expatriation movement in American history, but it did not last. Eventually, all but a few of the 10,000 or more exiles returned to the South, realizing that their best future lay not in rejecting America, but rebuilding it. Scenes like these ruins in South Carolina were simply too much for some of the defeated to bear. Rather than see them or try to rebuild in the new America, they chose exile instead. Some embittered Southerners burned their flags or buried them or tore them into pieces as souvenirs rather than surrender them. Happily, these banners survived as symbols of the sacrifices of their followers. Most men, North and South, seem to understand instinctively that the best hope for all of them lay in reconciliation, in putting the past behind them as quickly as possible. While President Davis vainly tried to carry on before he was captured, and while others disappeared into the southern hills or left for foreign shores, most Confederate leaders counseled otherwise. Men like General Robert E. Lee told their one-time soldiers to accept the verdict of the war, go home, and start building the South anew. From the first, These former rebel leaders tried to instill in the men a sense of pride in what they had done, what they stood, fought, and died for. Failure only ennobled their sacrifice and their cause. Defeat did not mean dishonor, and in no time the old soldier wit returned as Confederate veterans quipped that they were never really defeated, they just wore ourselves out whipping the Yankees. War is all hell broke loose and benumbs all the tender feelings of men and makes them brutes. I do not want to see any more such scenes, and yet I would not have missed this for any consideration. A type of national bunting flag displayed by ships of the Union Navy during the war. Years after the war, old Confederates live and remember in a soldier's home in Kentucky, reliving their battles and the days of their youth. Andrew Johnson succeeded Lincoln to the presidency after the assassination and attempted to effect peaceful reconciliation in spite of embittered feelings north and south. I fired a cannon. I hope it never killed anyone. Anonymous North Carolina artilleryman. They paid a terrible price. More than 623,000 men lost their lives, most of them to disease. At least another 471,000 wounded. In more than 10,000 actions, from tiny forgotten skirmishes to the mighty battles like Gettysburg, they drew each other's blood. In the Union, by the end, the war was costing almost $4 million a day, to a total cost of $1,295,100,000 for 1865 alone. All told, the Union probably spent over $4 billion. The South spent nearly $4 billion, most of which it borrowed and could never repay. Beyond this, none could calculate the cost of the damage done to Southern industry, railroads, cities, and agriculture. Most of the South's resources had been laid waste, and it would take generations to rebuild. Yet rebuild they would, and despite the strains of Reconstruction and then the decades of agitation over civil rights and the place of the now free blacks in Southern and American society, they would do it, for the most part, together. As John C. Breckinridge, once United States Vice President, then Confederate General and Secretary of War, said in 1866, just after the surrenders, "It is all right and far better that we live as one people." Now again, one people they would be. The Army version of the Medal of Honor. The soldiers themselves created the best memorials to their deeds. As in the decades after the war, they began erecting monuments all across the battlefields, north and south, places to remember and honor what they had done. This particular memorial was erected at Gettysburg 20 years after the battle. The naval version of the Medal of Honor in its case. Well, Johnny, I guess you fellows will go home now to stay. Look here, Yank, you guess, do ya, that we fellows are gonna go home to stay? Maybe we are, but don't be giving us any of your impudence. After you do, we'll come back and lick you again. Union and Confederate Veterans of Appomattox. With America reunited and growing rapidly, there was too much to do to keep alive the old hatreds. Respect came first, then admiration, and in after years, nostalgia and romanticism, all to blur and then diffuse their differences. By 1896, when the Democratic Party split, one faction nominated Union General John M. Palmer for the presidency, and as his running mate, Confederate General Simon B. Buckner. 2 years later, when America went to war with Spain, one-time Confederate generals donned the blue to fight side by side with their old foes. Reconciliation may have been slow, but it came in less time than it had taken for the old animosities to bring them to war in the first place. However adept they had been at killing one another, Americans simply were never very good, at hating each other. Veterans groups became a powerful political force in the years after the war. Amongst these surviving members of the 23rd Ohio, gathering 20 years after the Confederate surrender, is former President Rutherford B. Hayes. A selection of badges celebrating national encampments of the Grand Army of the Republic. Throughout the immediate post-war years, the GAR was the official voice of hundreds of thousands of Union veterans. And that, my friends, is the end of Brothers in Arms. I'm going to let this sit for a second so you can see the bibliography, picture credits, major Civil War collections, etc. Lots of people assisted in this book. William C. Davis put this all together, and we'll just do a little read about William C. Davis, the author. William C. Davis graduated as a Master of Arts in History from Sonoma State College, Rohnert Park, California in 1969. Author of numerous books, his Breckinridge, Statesman, Soldier, Symbol, and Battle of Bull Run were both nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Mr. Davis has undertaken consultancy and advisory roles for many organizations, including the Eastern National Parks and Monuments Association, the U.S. Intelligence Historical Society, and the NOAA. He is a fellow of the U.S. Army Military History Institute, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the Royal Photographic Society, Bath, England, and an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters, Lincoln Memorial University, Harrogate, Tennessee. He has also written such books that are available from Smithmark Publishers Incorporated, including Rebels and Yankees series, Fighting Men of the Civil War, Commanders of the Civil War, Battlefields of the Civil War, and The American Frontier, Pioneers, Settlers, and Cowboys, 1800 to 1899. So, I hope you all enjoyed this read. I hope you all learned something from this read. It was fantastic. I'm glad that I got to share it with you guys. And I'll be looking for something else so I can maybe bring some more historical fact to your lives. Thank you again for watching. Thank you to my Uncle Dave for finding this book for me and lending it to me. And thank you to William C. Davis for putting this all together. We appreciate it. Thank you all. We'll see you soon. Bye, guys.